We also want to thank our sponsors who are joining us this morning. Constellation, an Exelon company, is one of our sponsors. We also have a sponsorship from Nuclear Powers Maryland and one of our speakers today. We are thankful to Siemens for their sponsorship and for one of our speakers today. And we also want to thank Resnick for sponsoring the speaker series in its entirety this year. Resnick is a local firm. I have the pleasure of moderating our session today, and I'd like to introduce our various speakers. First, James Riley, who's the head of research and development in clean air solutions for Siemens. James has been involved since the beginning of the UK Clean Air Zone Solutions, delivering solutions across the UK, and he is currently coming to us from the southern part of the coast of England. He's been working in the technology industry for over 25 years, finding innovative ways to solve problems, and for the past 6 years, specifically in the area of road safety and air quality. An additional speaker, Charles Hernick, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum. Charles leads CRES's forum's policy work and executes strategies to advance clean energy solutions and innovative approaches to reducing carbon emissions. He's on the MCEC advisory board, and he has an MA in International Relations and Environmental Policy from Boston University and a bachelor's in Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior from the University of Minnesota. We are also honored to have Senator Paul Pinske, who is the chairman of the Senate Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee from District 22 of the Maryland General Assembly. Senator Pinske was elected to the Senate in 1994 after 2 terms in the House. He's worked in the legislature for over 20 years, sponsoring legislation to implement healthcare for all, achieve public campaign financing, and protect our environment. Senator Pinske has also worked in the field of education for over 40 years as a high school history teacher, teacher advocate, and policy consultant on educator effectiveness. He resides in University Park, Maryland, which is my old stomping grounds. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Harrison Strang, who is the acting state forester for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Forest Service. Anne's bachelor's degree in forest management is from Virginia Tech, go Hokies, with a master's degree in forest soils from the University of Minnesota. So you and Charles have that in common, and a PhD from Oregon State University in forest hydrology. Over her 25-year career with the Maryland Forest Service, she's led climate adaptation issues and pursued a wide variety of partnerships for watershed restoration throughout forestry and forest management. And finally, Christine Cismadia. She's the Director of State Government Affairs and Advocacy for the Nuclear Energy Institute. She's been with NEI for over 15 years, developing and launching state and local grassroots campaigns. As the director, she manages coalition building, grassroots mobilization, and state and local elected official education and outreach. Christine received her undergraduate degree from George Mason University in communication and persuasive discourse, and completed graduate studies from Johns Hopkins University in political communication. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're going to start with James, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of his perspective at the 50,000 foot level from across the pond. James, thanks for being here.
Good morning. It's a little difficult and odd for me to say good morning because where I'm sitting here, it's very much good afternoon, but you'll forgive me for that. It's great to be with you today, and I just really briefly explain a little bit of the background where we're coming at, what I've been involved in, and I'm just going to use just a few slides, just a handful of slides to talk about this. If we can move to the next slide and just think about the problem, okay? And I know this is very much a UK perspective coming into this meeting today, and by sharing that, I hope maybe that sort of generates some of the discussion about how some of these things can be elsewhere or be relevant elsewhere. The fundamental thing is air quality and how that could be linked to climate change and problems we have. And the health in general of the population. And there has been some significant statements, I think, from the World Health Organization and also the Supreme Court ruling back in 2015, where Climate Earth challenged the government, the UK government, and won that they had to really clean up air quality in cities. And this really hit the headlines earlier this year, where it was recorded that a little girl called Ella, who was 9, she died in 2013. But actually on her death certificate, it was stated that the air quality, she lived just around the outskirts of London, and air quality was a significant contribution to her death. And so basically across the whole of the UK right now, there is this real focus from the government to clean up air quality and to make the air better for our health, for our well-being, and ultimately, of course, the link into the effect that has on our climate. If we can just move to the next slide. Really, all I want you to take in from this slide is just the amount, say, of dots on the right-hand side, right across the UK. The green areas are the ones where the government have already said, right, these cities, you must establish a clean air plan and a clean air zone plan. In fact, many of those cities, the government said you must also use an enforceable solution, and we'll touch on that in a moment. The yellow areas, which is even more, are absolutely expected to be planning for a clean air zone or have to have a clean air plan in order to address problems that they have. And then there's just a few in there, the red ones, where they've actually said, actually, hold on, no, we want to do this in a different way. Something really, really fundamental to get across in this is that what the government are trying to do is accelerate behavioral change that allows us to achieve a sustainable improvement in air quality. So a lot of what I'm involved in are ways in which we can accelerate that behavioral change to get either a different mode of transport or to make a different decision on the way or even in the journey that's going to be made. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you see some of the more enforcement type approaches that the government have set out to say, okay, well, you could have a clean air zone that, say, is a class C, and then all the different vehicles along the bottom would now be not allowed to drive into your city unless they perhaps pay a fee to do so. And if they don't, then they're fined. Now that, again, this is about accelerating behavioral change and not on its own a solution. And so there are all sorts of complementary measures that are then built around these systems to have the investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the grants for fleets to have better vehicles to travel in, all of these different sort of plans that they will have and have to share in order to actually launch this. Our part that we're working on at the moment and have been working in for quite a long is that piece. Maybe it's the stick that goes with the carrot, I don't know. But to generate that change quickly is the enforcement system. And if we can just move to the next slide, you'll see that what we have within our system is sort of a range of different, if we look on the left-hand side here, a range of different devices that could be out on the street, from cameras that are mounted on poles. And of course, every country, even every state, if we talk about America, will have different rules. The legislation has to be in place even to be able to use this sort of process to accelerate that behavioral change. Again, we're fortunate that in the UK, the government have really led there in creating that legislation to allow this sort of system to really bring about the changes that dramatically increase the air quality in the cities. So whether it's a camera mounted on a pole or a temporary one on a trailer, or even a car that's driving around with a camera, all of that data is coming in. We have the JACU, which is the Joint Air Quality Unit, which has been set up by the government, part of their Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs, that is then involved in actually telling which vehicles are valid, allowed, not allowed, have they paid, yes, no, etc., etc. This is just a glimpse of the sort of system that we're putting out. We've been running a system like this in London for over 10 years. Recently, that became what was known as the ultra low emission zone. And I'll show you a few figures from that in a moment. We're now deploying that across a whole range of other cities in the UK. We've gone live in Birmingham. Portsmouth is about to come live. And we're just installing right across Manchester, again, the second largest city in the UK, to really address this problem. So perhaps the most important thing, what does all of this actually bring about? If I say this is about accelerating behavioral change, does this actually work? Well, my last slide for you today is just a way of showing some of those figures. And this is all pre-COVID data, because COVID, of course, has had a massive impact on the mobility sector and air quality within cities. But here I'm presenting data from 2016 to 2019, and I'm not going to go through all of this now. We don't have time, but let's just pick out the key figures on the left-hand side. First of all, the NO2 levels. How has that been affected? Well, the reduction is 94% measured from 2016 to 2019. If you look in terms of the primary and secondary schools in areas exceeding the legal limit, again, there a 97% increase in that. And if you look, you go on down here, there's the 97% reduction, 5 times the national average in London has been reduced within these areas. So there's been reductions across the whole city, across the whole country, but London has been by far the biggest. Why? Because these schemes actually work to accelerate behavioral change and to improve the air quality. There's topics in here then for us to discuss later around the legislation that's required to make this actually happen, and then actually the kind of technology that can really achieve these kind of figures. Now, I can see my time has raced away from me, but I think I'm just about there to capture the basics of what we're doing as Siemens across the UK, and I hope that can inspire some thought for you today.
Thank you, James. It's good to have this information and this model. I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions for James, please put them in the chat in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Our next presenter is Charles Hernick. Charles, welcome.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you to the Maryland Clean Energy Center for hosting this timely conversation. Happy National Clean Energy Week. If you're not celebrating at home, it's not too late. We're only at Tuesday. But Google National Clean Energy Week and celebrate how you can. And I think by getting some information in this seminar right here is of vital importance. And thank you, James, for kicking us off and giving that perspective from the UK. I'm going to talk a little bit more focused at the US federal level and then bring it down to the regional and state level, where I think we'll be able to continue more of the conversation. And it really does matter when we're talking about climate change and climate-centric solutions. We're talking about a global problem. And what we're talking about, in my mind, the solutions that we need to be as numerous as possible. So we need to increase the number of solutions through innovation and decrease their costs through widespread deployment and further innovation to make it easier to produce these new types of clean energy in the most environmentally sound way possible. Looking at the title of the seminar here, Climate-Centric Solutions, it's great that James pointed out a couple of them. I think that one of the key things that we need to look at when we look at the strategies component of this, at least in the US case, is that we need to assure that the policies are bipartisan so that they can be robust, appeal to folks across the United States, appeal to folks across Maryland, and therefore be durable in the long run. And I think that that's one where we don't have a lot of time on the clock to solve the climate problem, and we need to use the time as judiciously as possible. And so we can't have this flip-flopping between administrations on policy. We really do need to work at where the common denominator is. And I'd argue that, at least in Washington, the tone has changed substantially, even in the last year, with respect to addressing the climate problem. At the close of 2020, there were $34 billion in tax incentives and innovation passed through the Energy Act of 2020. It's a really big deal, something that folks may not have noticed, and indeed Congress is looking at how to appropriate some of those funds, but the tax credits were available immediately. Tax credits for offshore wind, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as energy efficiency, which is a major area where we can be doing better across the country. Pilot programs were authorized for nuclear power, carbon capture, direct air capture, storage, geothermal, energy efficiency, and carbon capture utilization and storage were authorized for the Department of Energy to spend money through their loan programs. One other bipartisan achievement in the Senate this year was the passage of the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And it is a modest climate bill, won't solve all the problems, but it passed by a vote of 92-8 in the US Senate. So overwhelming bipartisan consensus focused on empowering farmers to be able to develop carbon credits, carbon offsets for sale in voluntary carbon markets. I've read stories of Maryland farmers being able to raise their annual income by $100,000 a year. That's real money. And I think it's one where we are empowering, we have the opportunity to empower more and more farmers across America. And my hope is that, and we can talk a little bit more about natural sequestration opportunities that exist in Maryland and across the US later on. There are also important infrastructure, energy provisions in the bipartisan act that passed the Senate. Right now, both the Senate and the House are wrangling with this massive reconciliation package that could spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, but a very narrowly targeted infrastructure bill that would help inform or improve regulations so that folks can build offshore wind in a timely fashion and build transmission that we need across Maryland and the United States in a timely fashion would be critical. Lots of electric vehicle charging funds would be provided through that too. I think looking at the regional level, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but we need to look at what's worked and what hasn't. Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative going on for over a decade has worked very well in a bipartisan fashion across a number of states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. The Transportation Climate Initiative hasn't yet. And I think that there is time still on the clock, but perhaps it's been too blunt of an instrument. And looking at the memorandum of understanding that was achieved by the Hogan administration and several other governors to look at heavy and medium-sized trucks was a step in the right direction. Transportation is going to be the most difficult area to tackle, and I hope that that's something that we can talk about more. But at the end of the day, we need an all-of-the-above clean energy approach that will work for Maryland at the most local level possible. We have huge assets here in the state. We generate a lot of clean nuclear power. We have one of the top two small modular reactor companies in the world here in Maryland, X Energy. They're looking for sites to deploy, and they haven't yet deployed anything here. So I think it's worth having the conversation on what we can say yes to in our own backyard and how we can continue to look forward at what's best for Maryland in a bipartisan way that will increase options and reduce costs for our neighbors.
Thanks, Charles. That's a great summary. We'll have some questions for you later about what's happening with policy in Washington right now, and particularly the infrastructure bill that has some funding in it for investment in climate solutions. But before we do, once again, it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Paul Pinske. You have a big task in front of you every single year, managing policy in this space, Senator. We are happy that you're here this morning to talk about your job and what that entails.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank MCEC for inviting me. The degradation of climate is increasing. We all know that. The storms are more severe, the wildfires, the droughts, increased rains and hurricanes, changes in temperature that affect the environment, sea level rise. The implications are major for commerce. If you can't do business because of flooding, it's going to affect the bottom line. Food availability, countries like India, sea level rise, rice crops, it has major implications for the whole world and actually our existence. So to differ a little bit with a previous speaker, I don't think we can go for the least common denominator and be timid. I think we have to understand the urgency of the challenge in front of us. The speed of this living disaster is increasing. Heat will melt ice sheets, Antarctic or Greenland. They'll break off part of the shelves, and then you'll have increased melting, and this will, of course, will lead to sea level rise. There are tipping points. You know, I don't have to track the IPCC we've all tried to hopefully reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I think most people feel that's unlikely. So I believe we're faced with a situation both globally, nationally, and in the state of Maryland for fairly urgent actions. Let me just reel off a few of those. Obviously, the one is reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is, I think, is the umbrella, which calls for a change in policies and behaviors. We have to remove fossil fuels. I think we understand that. We have to increase electrification of the infrastructure. We have to have a major expansion of renewables, whether it's solar, wind turbines, offshore, geothermal, whatever. There's still obstacles. We in Maryland passed offshore wind a number of years ago. We've yet to start building. Hopefully that'll happen in the next 18 months. But there have been challenges across the nation on that. We have to have major changes in transportation. We have to get cars off the road. They're doing much more harm than the speed in which we're shifting to electric vehicles. We have to get the mass transit. I can speak for that in the Maryland, DC area, but we have to do that nationally. But we have to have a greater focus on energy efficiency. And of course, we have to welcome new technology. And all the while, and I think this is very important, we have to have a transition plan for our society that includes new job creation and supports for displaced workers, and to help reconstruct resource of outmoded industries. And finally, and I think a lot of you have this as your key interest, is we have to make strategic investments. We have to make investments with federal, state, other monies, private monies, in such a way that they're going to leverage even additional money to expand clean energy and help in those transition efforts. But we're also faced with a number of variables, and I want to put some of those out, and hopefully we can follow up on those during later discussion. The amount of federal support. We know the infrastructure bill is being debated in Congress, and it's likely, hopeful, that there'll be an additional revenue stream that can be invested in clean energy initiatives throughout the states and the federal government. I think we can also acknowledge the change in the federal government after the previous 4 years, where the federal government now understands it's a problem and we have to address it in a fairly aggressive way. Then a key question is, will the governments, and by that I mean federal, state, and local, and other public entities like local school systems, will they lead by example? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Will the private sector adapt to the needed changes or hold on to the status quo? Now, putting aside those companies that are investing in clean energy, but those companies that are constructing large buildings, retail, commercial, et cetera, do they want to help change building codes, energy efficiency, which leads to the question is, while we know these changes will improve the environment, in terms of the transition, will these be money makers, and will the upfront investments be recouped by the private sector? We know large buildings, renovations, or new construction calls for significant upfront money to make it more energy efficient, to have better building codes, to make it more electrified. Our belief is that it can be recouped, and this becomes a moneymaker, which will encourage the private sector to be on board as an ally and not as an opponent. Now, where does that lead us? Last year in the Maryland legislature and the Senate, we passed the Climate Solutions Now Act. It was an ambitious omnibus bill. It ran into some challenges in the House of Delegates. Some form of that bill will be reintroduced this year, and I'm extremely optimistic that the Maryland legislature will pass such legislation. So, and in that bill, just to give you an example, and it might not look the same in January, we had fairly aggressive building codes for new construction and multi-million-dollar renovations. We put measures in to address methane and methane leakage. It hasn't been measured correctly, and methane is 50 times worse than carbon dioxide, and we think it's an area that takes a lot of our concern going forward. We call for a 60% reduction of our previous levels by 2030 and a net neutral, carbon neutral by 2045. We talked about new schools being net carbon neutral and solar ready. For those of you familiar in Maryland, increase in power, which is the state law in terms of energy efficiency from 2.0 to 2.7 per year. We call for the state, as I mentioned earlier, to lead by example and turn over its fleet of light vehicles to electric vehicles. We can't expect a lot of Joe and Mary citizen to make this investment if the state doesn't lead itself. We had a number of other components, for example, planting 5 million trees over the next 10 years. And we actually pulled that out of the comprehensive bill and passed that last year. And I know you're going to hear from the forestry sector in a moment. That is a twofer in the state of Maryland. It absorbs carbon dioxide, but it also helps clean up the bay. When the trees are planted appropriately near streams and rivers, it also filters and cleans up the bay at the same time. We also were able to pass going electric on our buses across the state. So, you know, there's a national problem. We're trying to address it in the state with legislation. There will be legislation. I'm hopeful we can continue these conversations later on during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to quickly move to a poll of the audience before we get on to our next speaker. This is your opportunity to contribute your thoughts. If you look at the question, climate change and energy regulations, policies, incentives will most certainly be a topic of discussion, as the senator alluded, in the coming gubernatorial election cycle. Which of the following topics or ideas would be of most interest to you for implementation with the next state administration? You can check more than one based on what my tech people are telling me. And we're going to hold the results of this poll until after our next two presenters have a chance to introduce themselves. We probably should have had an all of the above button, but we'd like you to help us narrow it down. Great. All right. So our next presenter is Ann Harrison Strang. I've had the good fortune to work with Ann in our Biomass Energy Initiative in the past couple of years. She's a sharp cookie. And Ann, we'd like to hear from you about how Maryland can foster sustainability by supplying energy from woody biomass waste materials, and then your overview will be appreciated.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and I'm really excited to be here and talk about the really core role that Maryland Forest can play for climate-centric solutions. I wanted to do a call out for the Tree Solutions Now Act. We're pretty excited to be looking at new opportunities to plant trees, and you know, it is very much correct that it's a twofer. Can we go to the next slide? And I wanted to talk not just about the tree planting part, because I think most people get that, you know, tree planting helps us do carbon sequestration and is great for water quality. I wanted to move a little beyond that and go into, you know, once we have our forests, how do we manage them, and how do we really get to some of the extra bonuses that we can get with forestry towards climate solutions. So when we talk about what climate adapted forestry and forest management, what we're talking about is I'm trying to think about how do we have our forests resist the increased level of disturbances that we are seeing. Forest is the native land cover in most of Maryland, and so we are looking to, you know, expand that wherever we can. So we're looking at diversity of both of species and age, where the forests don't end up being able to resist certain disturbances, then we're going to that next step. After a disturbance, can that forest reestablish itself? You know, are we building in resilience and the ability to regenerate? And we have some real challenges with today's ecology because we've taken fire off the landscape, we've taken our top predators off the landscape, and so we have a whole lot more deer. Deer are native, but they're taking a toll on our forest understory. We have a lot more invasive species. So those are some of the things that are challenges for maintaining resilience in our forests. And then we're also looking for where are opportunities for transitioning to new conditions, and as species changes. We are in the mid-Atlantic, and we're in the middle of the range of a lot of species, so it's not dramatic for a lot of our area, but there's definitely going to be some shifts, and that we need to be cognizant of those and find the opportunities where it's the right fit for the land owner's goals. Next slide. So when we think about the interaction of forests and carbon, we're looking at it much like a investment portfolio. Most of Maryland's forests are now in the 80 to 100-year-old. That our biggest category is the 80 to 100-year-old. Most of them are between 60 and 100 years. So we're in that with a lot of mature forests, which is wonderful. We are growing several times what is either being removed through harvest or being lost through natural mortality. So we're looking at this mix. We're looking to build a mix of the older forests, which are great for storage, but it is a place where we see less growth, and our mortality rates, when we look at our forest inventory data, growth is going down and mortality is going up. And it's really setting the stage for some significant forest health issues coming up. And so a really important part of our portfolio is those young forests that are created through some of our forest management activities. It's not storing as much as an older forest, but that's where the growth rates are highest. And it really is an investment in not just meeting today's needs for renewable resources, but tomorrow's carbon sequestration. When we're looking at forest management, we're not just looking at the carbon consequences. We're trying to say, how can we put it out there to also expand water quality? The wildlife biologists are telling us that we need to be building really a mosaic with that mixture of our older forests, mature forests, young forests, and other habitats, our grasslands and hedgerows, to really meet all of the habitat needs out there. One of the most declining suites of species are some of our grassland birds. Some of those are also maintained through early successional forests. So when you have, after fire, after major hurricanes, that when we don't have the fire on the landscape, we can use forest management to get towards some of that. One of the things that has been seen in the Southeast as they've seen expanded markets is they're seeing expanded forest cover, and Maryland has ambitions towards no net loss. So we are looking to have some of that no net loss be helped by having the right kind of markets that can support good forest management in Maryland. One other element for climate adaptation is good spacing on trees is the thing that builds drought resistance, and we can also use to help manage fuel loading as we've been having warmer and wetter conditions in Maryland, but there are the periodic droughts that we still have some real risk from fire, and so the way in which we manage our forests can help us manage that when it does become a hazard. If we really want the carbon bump from forest management, we look to our harvested wood product mix. Things, once those young forests may have low storage, but the products from those are going to meet today's needs in one of the lowest carbon footprint that we have for products. And so those products extend carbon storage benefits. The longest storage is going to be in our solid wood products and durable goods and our houses and that furniture that you hand down generation to generation, like my daughter sleeping in her grandmother's bed. That's long-term carbon sequestration. But we're also looking in terms of energy solutions at the role of woody biomass, really essential market for thinning that's needed to make those larger trees that make the long-lived wood products. And woody biomass is displacing those fossil fuels, is growing the demand for more forests. And when we do wood for energy, that's all local. That's creating local jobs, and it's given us more resilience for local supplies. We need to use clean new technology as we're expanding woody biomass to make sure we're getting the air quality standards that we need, but we have the regulations in Maryland to do that. And Europeans have been real leaders in technology. Some of the other products like mulch, getting to Charles's point about nature-based solutions, some of that's, building the soil carbon storage. And last slide. So bottom line, we are looking at sustainable forestry to really meet fundamental needs. If we're talking sustainability writ large, we need to grow a lot of what we use, recycle that, reuse it, and consider it over the whole life cycles and the landscape. For Maryland and resilience, we need to be trying to meet what we can locally, not just import our needs. And we need to do management in a way that's building biodiversity and more forests. So, bottom line, our forests are part of our climate-centric solutions that help us really care for the land and build jobs and livelihoods for people so that we can keep our landscapes, the watersheds rural, which is a real key part of being able to restore our whole watersheds. So, thanks so much.
Good stuff, Ann. Good stuff. And I appreciate you calling attention to life cycle management for products and materials. It's really something that is taking hold globally, and Maryland has the potential to be a leader in that space with all of our expertise in technology development. So thanks, Ann. And our final presenter this morning is Christine Cismadia. Christine, I hope I'm saying that right.
Oh,
and Christine is again the Director of State Government Affairs and Advocacy for the Nuclear Energy Institute. So a whole other direction in the all of the above category.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Sabrina, and the entire Maryland Clean Energy Center team for this very kind invitation to join this important dialogue. I'm Christine Cismadia. I'm the Director of State Government Affairs for NEI. So NEI is the trade association in Washington that represents the owners and operators of the nuclear fleet, but also we represent the national labs, the supply chain, the academic institutions that train the workforce, and many other stakeholders in the nuclear industry. But I'm also here representing Nuclear Powers Maryland, which is a state-based coalition. And nuclear and NEI really actually supports dozens of pro-nuclear local coalitions all over the country. And so we're a proud member, along with a lot of our other members that have been mentioned here today, this morning, Exelon, X-Energy, Centrus, Orano, and many, many more. If we go to that first slide. So I'd like to give you just a quick big picture look at what nuclear looks like in the US, and then I'm going to share with you some climate policy trends that are impacting the nuclear industry. So first, The nuclear fleet is 93 reactors in 28 states. And nuclear provides nearly 20% of the electricity in the country, but over 50% of the country's carbon-free generation. So the 2 reactors at Calvert Cliffs, that's about 38% of the state's electricity, but it's 82% of the carbon-free generation in the state. So Maryland is very fortunate to have such a significant asset in-house. And if we just go to the next slide, I promise I don't have a lot of slides. This is my final one. So secondly, the value proposition of nuclear includes, both environmental and economic benefits. Nationally, the industry supports 475,000 primary and secondary jobs, 60 billion in GDP. Nuclear plants are economic engines for surrounding communities and provide significant tax base and very high-paying salaries for the workforce. And this slide also shows some of the environmental metrics. So you see here the 528 metric tons of carbon emissions avoided, among others. And so this is where we're seeing state and federal policymakers really recognize that unique value proposition of nuclear. And we're seeing this come through in policies in a couple of different ways. The first is that states with the existing nuclear assets, those 93 reactors, are adopting policies that recognize nuclear in their clean energy plans and programs. So states like Washington, California, New Mexico, there's plenty of others, have adopted clean energy standards with technology neutral language. So nuclear is included in how they can reach their clean energy goals. Another example is Virginia has just released a state strategic plan on how best to leverage their nuclear assets in the state. And then some states have adopted what we call ZECs, so zero emission credit programs. And this is a reward for nuclear for having a carbon-free attribute. And so the second big trend that we're seeing is that states are incentivizing new nuclear. The industry is full of developers looking to deploy the next generation of reactors, and this ranges in size and design. And these small modular reactors are flexible options for states like Alaska with remote populations, or maybe they have a smaller demand needs versus the larger reactors. So states are incentivizing new nuclear in many forms, and they're coming up with some really smart, creative ideas. Some examples of this are there's state tax incentives for SMRs, that's the small modular reactors, in states like Idaho and Nebraska. Idaho doesn't have any current nuclear, but the first designed by a company called NuScale out of Oregon, they're set to deploy their reactor at the Idaho National Lab. And that's an interesting state just because they're incentivizing the next deployment. So there's also examples of cost recovery available. States like Missouri and North Carolina just this past year have considered different versions of cost recovery plans on how to help deploy those projects. Right now, Montana is conducting a study on where best in the state to site a small modular reactor. The study should be done next year, so they're going to continue their conversation. And then an interesting bill out of Wyoming just passed this last year. They passed a resolution that calls for their coal plant closures to be replaced with small modular reactors. So you can tell that there's a whole range of policies and some really creative ideas out there. And those are all, ideas that we're seeing continued conversations by policymakers. So I'm excited to represent Nuclear Powers Maryland and to see what Maryland comes up with in terms of incentivizing and recognizing their nuclear assets. So thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Christine. That is certainly thought-provoking. And I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A feature so that we can recognize your question and share that with our panelists. But before we go to our discussion session, we want to take the opportunity to share the results of our poll, our earlier poll. As you can see, the questions, these were the various topics. Wow, pretty evenly distributed. It's looking like activating net zero emissions as soon as possible is a big interest area. Supporting clean tech innovation and tech transfer and funding to incentivize EV adoption were the three highest areas of policy interest by our audience. Again, pretty evenly distributed, but building codes is also up there. So thank you all for responding. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk with our panel. We asked each of them to help us understand what investments in infrastructure and policy needed to be in place to improve air quality, reduce carbon emissions, promote energy equity, and encourage clean energy job growth and economic development. And each of them have a different perspective. James, I'm going to start with you. We had a question from Alberto Zagata, who wanted to know, how has Brexit affected the implementation of these climate reduction efforts?
Good old Brexit comes up in every discussion from the UK. Honestly speaking, it's any impact from Brexit is dwarfed by what's happened with COVID. Cities right now who have been making these air plans and things. Let's talk about Leeds, which is a city in the north of the UK. They had a full plan. They were one of the first to go live with a clean air zone. And we were installing cameras, in fact, installing many cameras, and COVID hit. They were due to go live during that time. And as a result of that, it had a massive impact on traffic, such that, remember I said the enforcement system is about accelerating behavioral change. They analysed it and said, okay, well, actually, COVID has accelerated behavioural change. And with all the takes-ups of the incentives like grants and things like that, there's now no need actually for enforceable clean air zone solution. And so they actually disbanded the idea of going live with an enforcement system because they've already achieved a sustainable solution. So Brexit is really small in relation to how this is impacting what we can do to accelerate that behavioral change compared to what happened with a global pandemic, honestly speaking.
Great, thanks, James. We have one other question in the chat room there for, I guess, Christine. What is the status of NRC approval for small and modular reactor designs? And that comes from Adam Landsman.
Yeah, so I mentioned that the industry is full of developers. So they're all with different designs and they're all kind of on different tracks. The furthest along is the project that I mentioned out in Idaho. That project is designed by a company called NewScale out of Oregon. And they've gotten their preliminary design certification from the NRC, and we're expecting that final approval next year. But all of these developers and designers are on different tracks with the NRC, but many are further along and ready to be completed in terms of getting their final approval over the next couple of years here.
And then even as that happens, each state will have to implement its own regulatory framework for the adoption of that technology. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Every state and every project is on completely different tracks. There's different layers of regulatory oversight in terms of you have to get the design. So the safety design approval comes from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but every state has their own environmental review or siting review. So there's multiple layers depending on what the state's regulatory oversight looks like.
Right. Let's go back to Senator Pinske. Senator, Maryland's been a pretty progressive state in policies, regulations, and incentives to drive climate-centric solutions in the past. Looking toward the future, if you could wave a magic wand, what do you think Maryland needs to do to reestablish a leadership position in the country on reducing the impacts of climate change?
That's a big question, besides being a great question. There are many fronts. I wish I had more than one wand, I guess, or more than one wish, Kathy. Look, we've got to move towards more mass transit. I mean, transportation and buildings are the top two contributors to greenhouse gas. Look, do we need mass transit from Southern Maryland, Charles County to those people who work in DC, despite the pandemic and people working from home? Yes. Do we need the red line moving? Yes. So we need to get people out of their cars. So we need to invest in mass transit. Whether TCI is the answer or not, we could debate for many hours, and Charles mentioned it. It's been discussed. 3 areas have signed on, others have not. The other I would say is we've got to get started on offshore wind. And the other area, we have a number of projects in the queue for solar, particularly on the Eastern Shore. But unfortunately, the department that has oversight has been dragging its feet. They're ready to go with many watts of coverage for solar farms. And so far they've been blocked and have not gotten started. So we really have to be more efficient. We passed a bill last year. Hopefully we'll have an override in January or December to get the Public Service Commission and others to move a little bit more quickly on a lot of the solar efforts. I mean, there are a lot of people investing in that industry, and we have to get it on the ground, get them up. And we have to be creative as well. One person talked about raising their solar panels so animals could graze below them, so the farmers could keep grazing land and have solar. I would love to see the day where the marginal cost for raising even a little higher and actually growing crops and having a solar farm could both be done, so we can keep our cropland green and not turn it over to development, at the same time use it for clean energy. So, I mean, there are some of the things on my wish list.
Thank you. Let me just ask you real quick, and Charles, I'm going to give you a chance to respond too, about building electrification, particularly the idea of using water heaters for load balancing. Is that something that we should be seeing as a policy in Maryland as a way to incentivize that? Any comments on that, Senator, or Charles, if you want to weigh in?
I'll defer to Charles.
I don't have any specific and in-depth knowledge on the water heaters, but I think that the goal of looking at how buildings can be net zero, and I do applaud Senator Pinske's leadership and focus on buildings. These are long-term assets that are built and stay around for a long time. Understanding how they can not just be a part of demand, but also be a part of supply, energy supply, to bridge the gap during peak demand is of vital importance. I'm not an expert on water heaters. I can't speak to that. But you do see more and more buildings that are investing in energy storage that can help them bridge the gap if there is a power outage. But also, if we have better pricing and we can have more demand side management and have it where utilities are working and can be customers sometimes too, from folks that are able to sell power, whether that be folks that have an electric vehicle that's charging in their house, or a building that is able to utilize energy that it has stored in a small, in a dozen computers or in dozens of batteries, whatever that makeup is, that's going to be the next generation of technology that we need deployed to really make sure that we are able to, in real time, have supply meet demand and not overbuild and overcompensate for electricity generation.
Kathy, if I could add just very briefly, I would direct people, there was an article, the Washington Post did an in-depth article about the greening of the Empire State Building about a year and a half ago. The Empire State Building did a multi-million-dollar renovation, and they were challenged to make it more energy efficient and put the upfront money, if they could recoup their money in a certain period of time. And they did a lot of creative things in transforming their elevators into energy producers and using that energy, for example. I believe they reduced their energy or increased their energy efficiency by 30 to 40% and were projected to recoup their investments in a very reasonable amount of time to where they actually make money. So it can be done, and I agree with Charles. We have to be creative, and many of these buildings, renovation, new construction, can actually be energy generators as well as energy users.
That's an excellent point. And I think looking at the state buildings as the lead by example, it's something that as policymakers, I think holding accountable those that manage those buildings and are responsible for operating those buildings to say we need to have the most efficient and well-managed buildings that we can for not only the building energy consumption, but the health of our workforce as well. So that's a topic we should have a whole webinar on. And let's shift a little back to you. Some specific examples of woody biomass energy opportunities that might be deployed in our state. I mean, we want people to understand that we're not just talking about throwing wood into a generator from the heat to create electricity. This is a very elegant solution for building energy consumption, heat and power.
Right. So when we're talking about wood energy, we're not talking about having it, be a major source. I mean, if you look back to some of the other slides, you could see it's a pretty tiny source right now. And if we expand it to the extent that we need for good forest management, it's still going to be a pretty modest portion of our energy picture. It's just really important for, our rural watershed condition and rural livelihoods. So the sector that woody biomass is really a fit for in Maryland, the right size solution for Maryland, is the combined heat and power. Just the characteristics of wood's energy profile means that it's a best fit for heating solutions rather than necessarily straight electricity. So where we've identified the high efficiencies is in this combined heat and power arena. And so, for example, you could, we had an analysis done for a community college in the state, and they wanted to, look at, replacing some of their heating. The upfront costs of these systems are higher, but you can end up with fuel savings and again, have reasonable payback periods for that investment. So you have fuel savings and you have local jobs generated and forest health benefits because you're managing density in your local forests. So some of the analysis from that one community college potential was that they would save $160,000 a year. They would replace about 50,000 gallons of gas and 77,000 gallons of propane. And that means that you have less exposure to some of the volatility of those oil and gas markets.
Right, and the fossil fuel consumption. I do want to point out too, it's something I've heard you all talk about, is that in the cities, in the metropolitan areas, just debris from storm refuse, trees that have fallen and the cleanup of that, there's something like 800,000 tons of woody biomass waste material that would otherwise be going into landfills that could potentially be a source of energy and heat for urban areas. So I just wanted to call attention to that. We do have a couple questions. Christine, one for you. Ned Tillman asks, how soon could SMRs be significant to meeting our needs?
Sure. So if Maryland is excited and interested in incentivizing new nuclear, I urge you to start sooner rather than later. There's 3 demonstration projects that are being supported by DOE right now. They're in Washington State, Wyoming, and in Idaho. And those projects have been underway for a couple years now. But you're definitely on a good 10-year track to get SMRs online. So I would urge the state to consider some kind of incentivizing program to get the process started.
So Alfred Bartlett notes, as Senator Pinske noted, Maryland has a critical gap between passing legislation and implementation of clean energy programs. Examples: offshore wind legislation passed in 2013, still not built. Virginia is already building offshore wind, and the process actively courting the offshore wind industry to make Maryland its mid-Atlantic hub. The Clean Energy Jobs Act requires 14.5% of electricity consumption by 2028, which will require about 6,000 megawatts of solar. From where we are now, this means building about 4,800 megawatts of solar over the next 8 years, or average of 600 megawatts a year. We only build about 150 megawatts a year. Al asks, what are the major barriers to implementation of the good policies we're passing, and what will it take to remove those barriers? I'm going to say leadership, but I'm going to turn that over to anybody that wants to take that tough question.
Well, Kathy, I usually don't shy from political questions. It has to do with politics, Dr. Bartlett, and they're very good points. You know, the former presidential administration, Trump administration, Congressman Harris, have tried to block the offshore wind, pushing it back off land. I think the Biden administration is more open to it and willing. And in fact, I believe U.S. Wind is going before the Public Service Commission to expand the megawatts potential construction. So I'm much more hopeful that's going to take off. You know, I mentioned the solar particularly on the Eastern Shore. A number of farmers would like to give off some of their land, hopefully not prime land, for solar farms. We have a few over there already. Unfortunately, the process allows review, although not approval, review by local county commissioners and county governments. Unfortunately, some of them don't want it. So they've dragged their feet. And there was a court case in Maryland called the Perennial case, which clearly said the state had final authority. Unfortunately, the state has not used that final authority. And we've wasted, I would say, 18 months to 24 months of getting some of those projects on the ground. So it has slowed us down. And you're absolutely right. The Renewable Energy Act called for a carve out, a major solar carve out, and we're slow on the uptake. So it's going to be very difficult to make that quota. So I think it's incumbent on us, for the governor and any support from the federal administration, to move more aggressively on solar, on offshore wind. And I think we have to be creative, as I mentioned before, and have new builders look at things like geothermal. I think they're fantastic other opportunities as well. So, you know, our policy and our practice have been at odds over the last 5 years, both at the state and the federal level. It's true.
Charles, let's go to you real quick. You're keeping your eye on what's happening with the infrastructure bill and what's happening in Washington. Do you want to comment on what you're seeing on the ground today?
It's different than what I saw yesterday. It's changing every day. I think that's part of the challenge. Speaker Pelosi has established a self-set deadline for the 27th of this month to pass the Senate-passed infrastructure bill with some degree of connection to a reconciliation package. The infrastructure bill that was passed by the Senate is obviously written, and it's tangible, and it has direct benefits to the clean energy economy. And it is the position of my organization, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, that the House should pass that bill, that Republicans and Democrats do see eye to eye on a number of the key provisions. There are some things that they don't agree on, but we should pass that bill to improve, to reform regulations so that clean energy can be deployed on a reasonable timescale through the federal review process, to build more carbon capture utilization technologies, build more of these nuclear demonstrations, build more electric vehicle charging stations that we know we need and that we need federal support for. The challenge with the reconciliation package, and again, this is the Democrat-only endeavor, is complicated by its own ambition. And I won't speak too much on it because there's a lot that's sometimes in and sometimes out, and clean energy payment programs for utilities and talk of a carbon tax and a lot of stuff for healthcare. And it's good to have a lot of ideas on the table. I'm a big fan of the competition of ideas. But the challenge there is that we're on a timeline and the American public wants results sooner than later. And to draft this legislation does take time. To get the estimates back from the Congressional Budget Office takes time. And so my concern is that the deadline of the 27th, unless there's more resolution on what that reconciliation package looks like, and there are some things that would be, that even energy utilities are concerned about, that would skew the clean energy market in the reconciliation package. There's other good stuff in there. Funding that would help with green banks, I think, is on the table. Still, that is an area where there have been a lot of great state efforts to build green banks. Maryland would be well served to have additional funding for that kind of endeavor. So that's important, but it's outside of my ability, because we just haven't seen enough of the text to know what's in and out. And therefore, it's really hard to guess on that timeline.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we all know that we cannot throw enough public money at this problem, that it's going to require private investment leveraged against that public money. And that's exactly what green banks are set up to do. We want to be playing in that space much more aggressively in the future. James, let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on policy. You have a nice perspective that we don't share from a more global perch. Based on your experience, policies that have worked that you think could be replicated in other places like our state?
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting, and I fully appreciate I'm kind of the fly on the wall in this meeting, in the sense that I'm the foreigner. You know, I could say things and you go, you know, it's not in the least bit relevant to the actual problems that you're really discussing and facing, and all that. So take what I say in a sense with a pinch of salt. But it's really interesting to see we've been circling around, and almost everybody has used that word incentive at some point of what they're talking about. And you know, I joked the carrot and the stick, but in a way that's it, isn't it? The incentive, but also then the kind of legislation to allow some kind of compliance or enforcement. That's the stick. No one likes that part, but maybe there's been some great initiatives to actually say, yep, let's do the offshore wind or the solar or whatever. But perhaps there's just that slight imbalance between that incentive to the enforcement. And when I look to what I presented on, particularly the clean air, there's no doubt that incentive worked well, to the point that, as I mentioned with Leeds, in the end, the COVID pandemic happened for them at a perfect moment, because they'd put out all the grants, the incentives were all there. People took up to actually invest in the electric vehicles. They started putting in the EV charging infrastructure across the city. They included many more cycleways and all of this kind of stuff to really make it viable for people to change the mode of their transport. And then the COVID took everyone off the road for a while. And then when they come back, those grants are in place. Now, again, that enforcement system can do that same sort of thing. But do you see that the balance between the carrot and the stick is so fundamental? And obviously, it goes without saying that the very first thing anyone's got to do is actually understand the problem, because your incentive could be completely mismatched to the actual outcome that you're trying to do. So modeling that, making the scenarios, simulating, we do some work with one of our companies called AIMSOM that models a whole city and looks at, as you apply certain things, how will that actually transform the way in which the mobility, as an example, is taking place within that city. Again, very UK centric, but I hope there's something in there that could inspire some sort of thought on a bigger picture. Yeah,
the observation that Americans don't like sticks. We're really good at gold stars and incentives, but we really don't like sticks. And unfortunately, we're going to have to really think about adopting some sticks in order to make the change we want to see happen.
Can I just say, I mean, you're touching on something there, which is, you know, it's not just Americans. We work across the entire world with our enforcement solutions. And actually, there's one tiny piece of policy in the UK, which is really unusual, but helps enormously in so many of these things when you're actually doing something that's got to affect, say, the everyday people who are driving their cars. And that is that if you're caught speeding or driving into an area you shouldn't, it's your legal obligation to reveal who was driving if it wasn't you. Now, in so many other countries, like, for example, Germany, you can't even take a photo of a driver unless you know that they are actually braking or causing some sort of contravention. And then it's got to be a photo of the driver's face and not just the car, because there's no legislation. It's not their right legally to reveal who was driving. And so I totally and I appreciate we're sitting in quite a particular space compared to so many globally in how to apply this technology. But technology, there's a way around all of that kind of stuff, isn't there? Ultimately, they're all solvable problems if we know what problem we're actually trying to solve, and then how to incentivize and just gently steer in that direction with a little bit of compliance.
Sure. Great point. Great point. There was a question asked about what should counties be doing, and I think that some of what James is saying, you know, is related to having a local plan, having the local counties take some initiative and responsibility for feeding up into the solution. I think Montgomery County is always a national leader in that space, but not all counties have the resources and the manpower that Montgomery County does to be able to develop strategies. I think MCEC can bring some technical support to counties that want to be doing energy plans and master energy plans for sustainability and resilience. And, I certainly welcome inquiries from county officials about how we could help them develop strategies. Nandini Muli, yes,
Kathy,
Senator.
on that, just this past month, Howard County went into a long-term contract with CSI for solar energy to power government buildings, including libraries. I don't think it includes the Howard County Hospital. And CSI is contracted with farmers. They're using parking lots. They're using roofs of existing county buildings. And County Executive Ball has taken a major step with this. I know they're in the East. I know they're in New Jersey and a number of other states, I think Virginia, to do a fairly significant contract to go solar and to have a company actually utilize Maryland to create that solar. They're not just buying it from other states. So I think there are examples of that across our state and across the nation.
Thank you, Senator. We're seeing some good chat in the chat feature. Again, let me remind you to post any questions you have for the panel. Nandini Muli comments on the woody biomass and CHP and points to the question is, how can we promote policies to have more woody biomass CHP for public buildings for a win-win solution besides renewable energy credits? Anne, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I did put something in the chat in response. One of the things that we just started doing this year, we applied for a U.S. Forest Service Wood Innovation Grant and are partnering with Maryland Clean Energy Center and a number of other partners interested in wood biomass and the forest health issues. So we were successful in that grant. First time we've gotten that one to stand up a wood energy team in Maryland, and the MCEC just brought somebody on to start, and we're introducing her to the rest of the team. She will be able to do outreach, analysis, follow up on some of the facilities where we know they would be good matches for the places where wood energy is a really efficient solution and doesn't have other lower cost solutions readily available to them. So we're going to identify facilities, provide that kind of technical support, and make sure they have information on the new clean technologies that we need to adopt. That said, it still tends to be higher upfront costs, a little lower familiarity of facilities managers, which is why some of the other incentives and credits are important for the effort.
So we're getting closer to our wrap-up time. I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to add final thoughts before we close out. And once again, if you have any questions for the panelists, please post them now. Let's go in reverse order. Let's start with Christine. Do you have any closing comments you want to offer for our audience this morning?
No, I appreciate the invitation. And I think it's so important that nuclear is included in all of these conversations. And as you all do continue talking and continue your policy considerations, just making sure that nuclear is a part of that picture is really, really important to your long-term strategy in meeting your climate goals. So thank you for the chance.
Yes. And you raise a really interesting point. There's this, we want climate mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction, and but are we going to be restrictive about the types of technologies that we allow to address that one concern, right? And I think as a community throughout the state, we need to look at, do the environmental benefits outweigh or equal or exceed the risks of this technology, and how do we embrace that for Maryland to achieve our climate goals? Anne, let's go with you next.
Okay, well, I'm going to follow up on the theme of all hands on deck and just encourage people to think about the right size place for wood and biomass energy in expanding forests in Maryland for community-based solutions that really look for all the co-benefits, not just the carbon or climate, but also addressing water quality, wildlife habitat, over the landscape and the life cycle of our systems.
Well said, Anne. The co-benefits, that's a great term that we can pick up here. And this is, I think, Charles, I'm going to go to you next. In one of our sessions to prep for this, you talked about needing to understand science versus politics to influence actions. And I think we're right on the edge of that here with this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely, Kathy. And I do want to echo what Christine and Anne said in terms of the tech-neutral need for climate solutions. At the very end of the day, we're talking about climate change that is caused by human emissions, greenhouse gases. So we should be focused on any state level policy should really be focused on those outcomes, reducing greenhouse gases. And understand that there's a net component to all of this, that there are going to be areas where we can sequester carbon. I think that Anne's conversation about what forests can do is important. What farmers can do is important. There's also a new generation of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about here. Part of that reason is because Maryland's just not a great place to store carbon in a geologic manner. But there are new technologies that are allowing folks to direct air capture or capture carbon dioxide that's coming off a natural gas or coal-fired power plant or industrial source and turn it into useful products. I'm talking about products like vodka that they're making out of carbon dioxide.
A useful product.
Yoga pants that they're making out of carbon dioxide, car tires that they're making out of carbon dioxide. And Maryland can either be a part of that next generation economy or not. And if we design policies that add in and aren't just focused on the technologies that are the sources of greenhouse gases, but are in fact focused on all the solutions that we can use to reduce greenhouse gases, I think that will be what are better served in the long run. So to keep that open mind, all of the above possible options and how we can reduce those costs will be well served.
Excellent point. Excellent point. The innovation economy that Maryland has benefited from in the past, now focusing on the clean tech opportunity to generate wealth for the state with our knowledge economy here. So, Senator, I'm going to give you the last word, because I think you have ranking policy authority here. So I'm going to go to James real quick. James, you've spent a morning with some Americans, and we're grateful to you for bringing your experience and your wisdom across the pond. Any last comments, words? Siemens is a tremendous partner in our state and a tremendous employer. We are grateful to have you with us today.
I just wanted to say thank you again for the invitation. I think it's been really, really fascinating for me, certainly. Brilliant mix of different aspects being brought into bear and into the consideration today, which is always makes it such an interesting conversation. So many different topics and slants for us to think about. And just to leave that, obviously, if there's anything that anyone wants to follow up and talk further about any of the areas that we're doing and have been working in this area now for quite some time, then please just get in touch, and I'll be really happy to continue the discussion.
Before we go to Senator Pinske, I want to riff off something that Charles was talking about, is having our policies tied to reducing carbon emissions. One of the challenges that I see from where I sit in the state is the ability to be accountable for the impact of our investments and of our policies. And we have a hard time tracking where we are in our climate goals. We have a hard time sort of publishing where we are in making impact. I think that is something that, as we move forward and we implement policies, we should be very deliberate about accountability for those investments achieving the desired outcomes and how we manage to that. And I offer that just as a sort of closing salvo, but I think that's been, we have the desire but data drives decisions, and data is part of what drives outcomes. So, Senator, I'm going to stop there and lob it over to you for final closing remarks from your perspective, and say thank you again for your participation this morning.
Well, Kathy, you make a great point. And I wish data drove the solutions more than politics. Unfortunately, Congress is tenuous in terms of what the expectations we might have over the next few months or longer, which drives us to say that the states need to take action. Some states have done things, California, New York, Oregon, and Washington. There is absolutely no reason Maryland should not be in that top tier of 3 to 5 or 6 states that are leading the nation with bold, thoughtful solutions. And I think the more states take opportunities to try concrete actions with accountability, you're absolutely right about that, they become laboratories, and the more successful strategies New York has put in building codes, California has obviously dealt with cars, the more those laboratories take initiative, use different creative solutions, and are bold because the times call for boldness. We can't wait. As Dr. Bosch, who I always consider the state scientist, said, early actions are important actions because the more we can reduce early, the less we're going to have pressuring us at the back end. So, look, I appreciate everything MCEC does to create this kind of conversation, figuring out ways to leverage investments from the private and public sector. And I hope to be part of those collaborative solutions along with you and everyone else.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you all so much again. Before we close today, we just want to mention that we have some more sessions upcoming in the weeks ahead through October. We will be bringing you a number of sessions. September 28th is our next topic, Driving Change, the Future of Transportation. We have a loaded panel to talk about that and the electrification of vehicles, hydrogen vehicles. And I think you'll find that one to be very interesting. And September 30th, we'll be talking about equity in the energy marketplace. October 5th, building and bankrolling energy projects. We'll be covering federal and state investments and incentives on October 7th. And workforce readiness for the advanced energy economy is also on the agenda for October 12th. And finally, wrapping it up with a fabulous panel on innovation. And I think part of what we've heard today is that innovation is a real opportunity for our state, for our country in the clean tech space. You'll hear everything from solar film technologies to storage and battery technologies that are cutting edge, carbon capture technologies, and what are utilities looking at in terms of investing in this space. So please plan to join us for those sessions. Once again, I want to thank our panel for a fabulous conversation and our audience for their participation. We will post the slides and the recording of the presentation online shortly after the session ends. Have a great day. We'll see you on the 28th.